In the closing years of the Second World War, as the skies over Europe filled with aircraft, and as factories on both sides pushed themselves to their absolute limits, one man watched the unfolding conflict with a perspective few others possessed. Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments and Production, stood at the very heart of the Reich's industrial engine. He had access to every number, every report, every production curve, every shortage, and every desperate attempt to compensate for losses Germany could no longer replace. From this vantage point, he could see not just battlefields, but the deeper forces that determined the war's fate: steel, fuel, manpower, aircraft, and above all, industrial capacity. And as Speer examined the figures pouring in from across the Atlantic, his realization grew darker with each passing month. America, an ocean away and untouched by bombing, was producing at a scale the world had never seen before. And in 1944, when U.S. factories rolled out more than 96,000 military aircraft in a single year, Speer understood the truth more clearly than Hitler ever did. The war was already lost, not because German soldiers lacked courage, not because German engineers lacked skill, but because Germany had picked a fight with a giant whose industrial power no European nation could match. To understand how Speer arrived at that moment of grim clarity, we must step back to the early years of the war, long before the collapse, long before the Allied bombing raids transformed German cities into rubble, long before the Luftwaffe reached its breaking point. In the late 1930s, Germany rearmed at a pace that shocked every observer. Factories roared back to life, their machine tools running day and night. The Luftwaffe, once hidden from the world by the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, expanded rapidly into one of the most formidable air forces on Earth. German propaganda boasted that the Reich was invincible, that German science and engineering were unmatched, and that no enemy could hope to compete with the precision and technological brilliance of German industry. But beneath the pride and pageantry, the German war machine had a fatal flaw. It was never built for a long war. It relied on speed, surprise, and short campaigns. Blitzkrieg was not just a military doctrine, it was an industrial necessity. Germany lacked the oil reserves, natural resources, and mass production capacity needed for a drawn-out conflict against multiple great powers. It could defeat Poland quickly. It could overrun France in weeks. It could strike hard at the Soviet Union, but it could not sustain a multi-front war against the USSR, the British Empire, and the United States simultaneously. Albert Speer understood this better than anyone. When he took control of Germany's armaments production in 1942, he found chaos, factory competition, overlapping authorities, inefficient supply lines, shortages of raw materials, and designs far too complex for mass manufacturing. German aircraft, for all their engineering excellence, required enormous labor per unit. A Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf simply took too long to build. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States was gearing up to produce aircraft the way Ford once produced cars. On assembly lines, in vast buildings, with standardized parts, and with an industrial workforce that expanded every month. In 1940, America was still mostly demobilized. The U.S. Army Air Corps had fewer than 3,000 aircraft, many outdated. American factories were not yet structured for war output. But once President Franklin Roosevelt pushed for rearmament, and once American industry was given the enormous wartime contracts that followed Pearl Harbor, the United States shifted from peace to war production at a speed that shocked even its own planners. The same nation that had struggled through the Great Depression suddenly unleashed its full industrial energy. Companies that once built cars or farm machinery now produced engines, bombers, fighters, and transport aircraft. Women entered the workforce in record numbers. New factories rose so quickly that from the sky they resembled small cities. By 1942, while German industry struggled to expand under Allied bombing, American factories surged ahead. The US produced nearly 48,000 aircraft that year, more than Japan and Germany combined. But it was in 1944, at the peak of its industrial power, that the United States reached a level Speer could only describe as terrifying. 96,000 aircraft rolled off American assembly lines in just 12 months. That meant nearly 8,000 planes every single month. That meant around 260 aircraft every day. That meant the United States was building an entire German Air Force every 24 hours. The numbers were not just impressive, they were decisive. No matter how many bombers the Luftwaffe shot down, America could replace them. No matter how many fighters were lost escorting bombing runs over Europe, the losses hardly dented U.S. reserves. The P-51 Mustang, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator, these aircraft were produced in quantities so massive that their presence filled the skies. And once they reached Europe in strength, once long-range escorts accompanied the bombers deep into the Reich, the Luftwaffe was broken. Its experienced pilots were killed faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages grounded entire squadrons. Spare parts ran dry. Training time shrank dramatically. Germany's Air Force, once feared, became desperately outnumbered and crippled by lack of resources. Speer saw all of this with devastating clarity. He saw the loss curves, he saw the production reports, he saw the fuel statistics, and he saw something else too, something even more threatening. While Germany was building bombers one by one, the United States was building factories that could build bombers. America wasn't just producing weapons, it was producing the capacity to produce weapons, and that meant Germany could never catch up. Not in a year, not in 5 years, not in a decade. Speer later wrote that when he examined the Allied production numbers, he realized the war had effectively ended in 1943, even though it continued for 2 more years. When he looked at U.S. aircraft output, he understood that Germany could no longer compete in the air. And without control of the skies, the Reich could not defend its factories, its troops, or its cities. Still, he continued to reorganize and push German industry as far as it could go. Speer streamlined designs, simplified processes, and encouraged mass production techniques that Germany had long resisted. He introduced central planning where chaos once reigned. Under his leadership, Germany actually increased production in 1943 and 1944, despite the relentless Allied bombing campaign. Tanks, submarines, aircraft, all rose in quantity, but compared to American numbers, these increases were insignificant. Germany produced around 40,000 military aircraft in 1944. The United States produced more than twice that number. Germany produced only a few thousand tanks. America, alongside the Soviet Union, built tens of thousands. Everywhere Speer looked, he saw the consequences of a fundamental mismatch. Germany was a nation fighting an industrial war it was never designed to win. The United States was a nation built for exactly that kind of war, powered by vast resources, enormous factories, limitless energy reserves, and a workforce of millions. By late 1944, the difference became visible even to those who did not study production. American bombers filled the sky over the Reich in formation so large that German civilians described them as a cloud or a moving city. The rumble of hundreds of engines shook the ground. German fighters, fewer in number than ever, threw themselves into battle, but their losses mounted rapidly. Many pilots flew against overwhelmingly larger formations, knowing they had little chance of returning. Speer watched helplessly as the Luftwaffe bled itself dry. Meanwhile, American factories continued producing aircraft, engines, fuel systems, spare parts, and ammunition in quantities that seemed limitless. By the final year of the war, no matter how many planes the U.S. lost, the replacements were already on the way. And so, when Speer later wrote that the moment he saw America produce 96,000 aircraft in 1944, he knew Germany was doomed, he was not exaggerating. He was acknowledging the grim reality that wars are not won by courage alone, nor by technology alone, nor even by brilliant strategy, but by the ability to sustain the fight. And in that arena, the United States was unmatched. This was the world Speer saw from inside the Reich's industrial core. A world where German workers labored desperately to keep pace, where factories were relocated underground, where shortages of coal, oil, aluminium, and steel crippled production, and where Allied bombers struck with increasing accuracy. A world where American designs grew simpler, more efficient, more standardized, while German designs grew more complex, more specialized, and ultimately less sustainable. What Speer understood, and what Hitler never truly accepted, was that numbers decide wars long before the shooting stops, and the numbers told a story that no amount of ideology or optimism could change. Germany had fought bravely. It had innovated brilliantly, but it had awakened a giant, and that giant had limitless resources and the industrial muscle to reshape the world. By 1944, the outcome was no longer in question. The skies over Europe belonged to the Allies. The factories of America were producing the machines that would end the war, and Albert Speer, surrounded by the paperwork of a collapsing empire, understood the truth that Germany could no longer escape. The Reich's defeat was not just likely, it was inevitable. Speer had returned to Germany with a warning echoing in his mind, a warning carved into every American assembly line he had seen. The United States was not merely building machines, it was building momentum, speed, and a rhythm of production that no nation at war had ever witnessed. And by 1943, that rhythm began crashing into Germany like a relentless tide. Night after night, the sky above the Reich turned red. American B-17 and B-24s appeared not in dozens, but in waves. Waves larger than anything the Luftwaffe had been designed to face. Pilots who once fought elegant, calculated dogfights were now thrust into a storm of industrial warfare. It wasn't one formation of bombers anymore. It was 3, then 5, then 10. Each formation carried more machines than an entire German aircraft factory could turn out in weeks. Inside these formations flew young Americans who had come from farms, steel towns, and universities. They were trained fast, deployed faster, and backed by an industrial base that promised an endless replacement of machines and men. When one bomber went down, 2 more rolled out of an American facility that same afternoon. And Germany could only watch its shrinking fleet burn against the clouds. In Berlin, Speer was now the man Hitler relied upon for miracles, miracles that he could not deliver. His factories were bombed, fuel stores vanished, and the workforce became thinner with every passing month. Yet Hitler demanded one thing only: more. More planes, more tanks, more weapons. The numbers didn't matter. Reality didn't matter. All that mattered was the Führer's fantasy of matching America blow for blow. Speer understood the cold truth. Germany was trying to outbuild a nation whose factories ran like thunder. American workers completed shifts with music playing on factory loudspeakers. They ate hot meals, returned home safely, and slept full nights. Meanwhile, German workers stood in the ruins of bombed plants, working by lantern light, surrounded by rubble and shortages. Each time Speer visited the front, the reports grew darker. Tiger battalions were immobilized due to lack of fuel. Aircraft squadrons flew only a fraction of their training hours. Ammunition production was slipping week after week. And on top of everything, the skies above Germany no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. They belonged to America. By 1944, when Speer received updated intelligence on U.S. production numbers, he felt the same sinking sensation he had felt years earlier in Detroit, California, and Ohio. 96,000 aircraft, fighters, bombers, transports rolled out of American factories in 1 year. It was not simply impressive, it was fatal. German engineers protested desperately. They argued that German planes were superior. They argued for jet fighters, rockets, innovations that might turn the tide. And many of these machines were indeed advanced, brilliant even, but brilliance meant nothing without mass. A handful of jet interceptors could not stop thousands of bombers. A dozen advanced prototypes could not defend an empire collapsing from every direction. Speer walked through assembly halls in Germany where workers used bare hands to weld and hammer. He remembered standing in sparkling American plants with pneumatic tools, conveyors, and automated cutters that produced more in an hour than some German workshops produced in a week. The contrast was devastating. Hitler refused to accept any of it. He dismissed American production as exaggerated propaganda. When Speer presented the real numbers, showing that American output was not just higher, but astronomically higher, Hitler waved the papers aside. He preferred to believe that German spirit alone would triumph. Spirit was not enough. Steel mattered. Oil mattered. Machines mattered. And America produced all three in quantities that reshaped the global balance of power. In late 1944, Allied bombers struck German fuel plants again. Without fuel, even the most advanced fighters became museum pieces sitting on runways. Pilots waited inside cockpits that would never taxi. Paratroopers trained for missions that would never launch. Meanwhile, American factories kept generating replacement aircraft in such numbers that entire air groups could be rebuilt in weeks. Speer's internal reports became a chronicle of the inevitable. The railway network was failing. Coal deliveries collapsed. Truck fleets were destroyed faster than they could be repaired. Factories operated at a fraction of capacity. Everywhere he looked, Speer saw numbers that told one story. A story that began the moment he first stepped into an American factory years earlier. Germany had entered a war it could never win. And he knew it long before anyone in Hitler's inner circle dared to admit it. By the time 1945 dawned, Speer no longer wondered if Germany was doomed. He wondered only how long the inevitable could be delayed. The Allied advance was swallowing territory faster than the Armaments Ministry could respond. American trucks, tanks, and planes appeared everywhere, from the beaches of Normandy to the bridges of the Rhine. Speer stood with a document listing America's total wartime production. It was a number so large that it felt almost mythic. Millions of tons of steel, tens of thousands of tanks, a flood of aircraft greater than the air forces of several nations combined. Hitler asked him one last time if Germany could still match American output. Hitler refused to listen, but America's factories didn't need him to listen. They were already delivering the final blow. Speer answered honestly for the first time. He told him the war was lost. By the time Berlin fell, Speer's early warnings had become the undeniable truth. The United States had not merely defeated Germany on the battlefield. It had overwhelmed it from the production line, burying the Reich beneath an avalanche of machinery, fuel, steel, and relentless industrial power. Speer would later write that when he saw American factories in 1937, he saw the future. He just never imagined he would one day watch that future crush the nation he served.